The whole street came outside to watch. Neighbors stood on their lawns, phones raised, eyes wide, because the Calloway boy had just stepped onto the grass in his fighting stance and pointed at a woman half his size like she was something he was going to destroy in front of everyone. He was 23 years old, a regional martial arts champion with a black belt he never stopped mentioning, and he had decided that today was the day he would teach the quiet nurse next door what happened when she forgot her place. He rolled his neck. He cracked his knuckles. He smiled at the crowd because he thought they were there to watch him win. He had no idea the woman standing across from him had spent 6 years as a combat medic, embedded with one of the most classified special operations units the Navy had ever deployed. He had no idea she had survived situations that would have ended most people before they got the chance to beg. He had no idea that her stillness wasn't fear. It was control. And he was about to find out the difference. If you're new here, welcome. Stay with me until the very end, because this story is going to take you somewhere you don't expect. If it moves you, hit like, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Nora Voss had lived in the same house on Cedar Line Drive for 4 years, and in that time she had become the kind of neighbor people borrowed things from but never really saw. She was 34. She worked the overnight shift at Harmon Valley General as a trauma nurse, which meant she was usually either sleeping during the day or driving to work before most people finished dinner. She kept her yard clean, her porch light on, and her past buried so deep she sometimes forgot it herself. She had a daughter named Cora, 13 years old, with a messy braid she refused to fix, and a habit of reading on the front steps until the sun was completely gone. Cora was the reason Nora had left everything behind. Not the combat, not the deployments, not even the friends she'd watched die in places the military would spend decades pretending never existed. It was the moment she realized she was starting to stop feeling afraid, and that frightened her more than anything overseas ever had. So she came home. She put in her papers, got her nursing credentials updated, and found a rental on a quiet street in Harmon Valley, where the biggest problem most mornings was the guy at the end of the block who let his dog use everyone's yard without cleaning up after it. For 4 years, it was exactly what she needed. Then the Calloway family moved in next door. They arrived on a Saturday with 2 moving trucks, a black SUV with tinted windows, and an attitude that settled over the street like a change in weather. The father, Garrett Calloway, was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades making other people feel smaller without ever raising his voice. He ran a private commercial development firm, the kind that bought up struggling properties and flipped them into things the original owners could no longer afford. He drove a car that cost more than most people in the neighborhood made in 2 years. He introduced himself to 3 neighbors in the first week and made it clear, without saying it directly, that he expected a certain standard on the street. His son, Damon, was something else entirely. Damon Calloway was 23 and had the physique of someone who treated the gym as a religion and his own reflection as a destination. He had competed in regional mixed martial arts circuits since he was 16, held a black belt in Taekwondo, and had been training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for the better part of 5 years under a well-known coach in the city. He was not unskilled. That was what made him dangerous. He had enough real ability to feel justified in everything else he did with it. The everything else included picking parking spots that blocked other driveways, playing music in the shared side yard until 11 on weeknights, and speaking to people in the neighborhood with the particular brand of politeness that was actually condescension wearing a costume. He called older women sweetheart without permission. He held eye contact a beat too long with anyone he sensed was uncomfortable. He was never technically rude enough to confront directly, and he knew it. Nora noticed all of this in the first 2 weeks and decided it was none of her business. She had done that calculation 100 times in her life. How much is this going to cost me versus how much peace does staying quiet buy? And she was good at it. She smiled when she passed him on the driveway. She didn't engage. She redirected Cora's attention when Cora started to say something sharp. "Not worth it," Nora told her one evening. "He took the whole picnic table in the side yard for 2 hours for his stretching," Cora said. "We were supposed to use it for the neighborhood cleanup thing. We used the porch. That's not the point." "I know," Nora said, "but some fights aren't worth having." Cora looked at her sideways. "You always say that." "Because it's almost always true. Almost." The first real problem happened in the 3rd week of October. The side yard between Nora's property and the Calloways was technically shared space. It had been that way since the previous owner had an informal arrangement with the family before them, and nobody had ever bothered to make it official because nobody had ever needed to. There was a wide concrete pad, a couple of wooden benches, and enough space that the three families on that side of the block occasionally used it for small gatherings or the annual block cleanup that the neighborhood association organized every fall. Damon had started using it as his personal training space. Not occasionally, every morning between 7 and 9, and again on weekends in the afternoon. He dragged out a heavy bag and hung it from a bracket he'd bolted into the wooden fence post without asking anyone, set up foam mats, and ran through routines that involved a lot of noise and a lot of presence. The neighbors on the other side, a retired couple named the Abernathys, had mentioned it politely once and been met with a smile so empty it might as well have been a wall. On the third Saturday in October, Cora went out to use the space. She had a science project involving some measurements and a long stretch of flat ground, and the concrete pad was the only option that worked. She was out there for maybe 10 minutes before Damon came out with his bag. He didn't say anything at first. He just started setting up around her, which meant she was essentially in the middle of his equipment. Cora moved to the edge. He moved his mat outward. She was pressed against the fence. "Hey," Cora said. "I'm kind of using this space right now." Damon looked at her like he was noticing her for the first time. "You measuring the concrete?" "For a project. I'll be done in like 20 minutes. I've got a training session. Can you maybe go a little later?" He picked up his jump rope and started to swing it. "This is my training time. This is shared space." He smiled at that, the kind of smile that doesn't have anything warm in it. "You're the nurse's kid, right? From next door?" "Yeah." "Tell your mom I said hi." He started jumping. The rope snapped the concrete 6 inches from Cora's foot. She gathered her things and went inside. She didn't say anything to Nora until later that evening, at dinner. Nora listened to the whole story without expression. She ate a bite of her food. She set her fork down. "Did he touch your stuff?" "No." "Did he say anything threatening?" Cora hesitated. "Not directly." "Okay." Nora picked her fork back up. "I'll talk to him tomorrow." "Mom." "I'll be calm. I'm not going to start anything." She looked at her daughter. "I just want him to know that what he did wasn't okay. What if he doesn't care? Then at least he knows someone noticed." She found Damon the next morning in the driveway, loading equipment into his car. She walked over without hurrying and waited until he looked up. "Morning," she said. He straightened. He looked at her the way people looked at someone they'd already filed away as irrelevant. "Morning. I'm Nora, from next door. I know who you are. Then you probably know I wanted to talk to you about yesterday, with my daughter in the side yard." He leaned against the car. "What about it?" "She was using the space. You made it impossible for her to stay." "I had a training session booked." "It's shared space, Damon. She asked if you could wait 20 minutes. He pulled on his gym bag strap. "It's my training time. I've got a schedule." "And she had a school project. She's 13. Nora kept her voice flat, not hostile, just clear. "I'm not asking for anything complicated. I'm asking you to be considerate of other people who live here." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You're a nurse, right? At the hospital?" "I am." "So you're used to people listening to you give orders." He smiled. "This isn't the hospital." Nora breathed. "It's not about orders. It's about being decent." He opened his car door. "My dad says the side yard arrangement was never formal, which means, technically, I'm not asking you technically, I'm asking you as a neighbor." He got in the car. He looked at her through the window for a second, then rolled it down an inch. "My dad will probably sort this out when he talks to the association. You might want to get ahead of it." He rolled the window up and backed out. Nora stood in the driveway for a moment. Then she went inside and made coffee and told herself it would blow over. She was wrong. 2 days later, Garrett Calloway appeared at her door. He was polished in the way that wealthy men often were. Every element of his appearance calibrated to signal that he had won something and intended to keep winning. He held a folded piece of paper, which turned out to be a printed copy of the Neighborhood Association's Shared Property Guidelines, with a highlighted section indicating that the side yard had no documented usage agreement. "I want to be reasonable," he said, which was exactly what people said when they had no intention of being reasonable. The space was being used informally, And that was fine. But now that we're here, I think it makes sense to formalize things. We'd like to claim primary usage rights during morning hours. Primary usage rights, Nora repeated, from 6 to 10. That covers Damon's training window. That's 4 hours of shared community space every morning. We're not blocking anyone out completely, just establishing a schedule. He smiled. I'm sure you understand. I understand what you're asking, Nora said. I don't agree to it. Something shifted in Garrett's eyes. Not anger exactly, more like recalibration. He had expected this to be easy. I'd hate for this to become adversarial, he said. So would I, Nora said, which is why I'd suggest we both agree that the space stays shared equally with no formal priority claims. My son has competitions coming up. His training is serious. My daughter has a right to use space she's been using for 4 years. Garrett looked past her into the house for a moment. We've also spoken to the association about the fence post situation. We plan to make that bracket permanent. It seemed like a good use of that location. He put that bracket there without asking anyone. The post is on our property line. Barely. Garrett folded his paper and put it back in his jacket pocket. I'll have the association reach out to you. I think that's probably the cleanest path forward. He nodded pleasantly and walked back to his house. Nora closed the door. She stood in her front hallway for a long moment. She knew what this was. She had seen this kind of maneuvering before, not in neighborhoods, but in chain-of-command disputes, in supply line arguments, in the specific way that people with institutional power moved against people they assumed had none. They didn't escalate directly. They went through channels. They made it procedural. They made it exhausting. She went to the kitchen and called the association herself. The association's response came 3 days later in the form of a letter explaining that they were reviewing the shared space guidelines and that all parties had been notified of the process. It was language designed to mean nothing and delay everything. Meanwhile, Damon's morning sessions in the side yard got louder. Whether this was intentional or coincidental, Nora couldn't say with certainty, but she noticed that the sessions now ran from 5:30 to 9 and involved a portable speaker at a volume that made sleeping through it impossible. She started waking up early. So did the Abernathys. So did 2 other houses on the block. She filed a noise complaint with the city on the 4th day. The complaint generated an automated response and a case number. Cora started coming downstairs bleary-eyed and short-tempered. "This is just going to keep happening, isn't it?" she said one morning. Not a question. "I'm working on it." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm using the options I have." "And if they don't work?" Nora handed her a glass of water. "We figure out the next options." Cora leaned against the counter. "What if he just doesn't care about any of the official stuff? What if he knows his dad can make it go away?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "Then we find something he can't make go away." She didn't say what she meant by that, partly because she didn't know yet, and partly because she was trying very hard to stay on the right side of a line she could feel herself being walked toward. The neighborhood association held a small, informal meeting on a Thursday evening at the Abernathy's house, which turned into something larger than expected because word spread that the Calloway situation was on the agenda. 11 people showed up. Garrett Calloway came alone, without Damon, and sat with his legs crossed and his jacket on like he was attending a business negotiation he'd already won. He spoke first, which Nora suspected was intentional. He framed the conversation around property rights, community standards, and the idea that some neighbors had informal arrangements that had simply never been properly documented. He didn't mention his son's name once. Nora listened to him for 4 minutes and then raised her hand. "I want to be clear about what's actually happened," she said. "A shared community space that's been used by this neighborhood for years is now being claimed 4 hours every morning by one household, without anyone's agreement, because they moved in 7 weeks ago and have the resources to tie it up in association process." She looked around the room. "That's not a documentation problem. That's a displacement." There was a moment of quiet that felt significant. Garrett smiled. "That's a characterization, not a fact. My daughter was squeezed out of a shared yard with a jump rope. My son had a scheduled session. Scheduled by whom? He has a training regimen in shared space that he didn't ask permission to use at that scale." The Abernathy's neighbor, a woman named Petra Solis, spoke up. "He's out there before 6 now. I can hear it from my bedroom." We've had noise complaints from 3 households, someone else said. Garrett's smile didn't waver. I understand there may be some adjustment period. We can certainly discuss the hours. We're discussing the principal, Nora said. The room went quieter. Garrett looked at her with an expression that said he was adjusting something internally, recategorizing her from nuisance to obstacle. Mrs. Voss, he said, I respect that you have a stake in this, but I think you might be overreacting to what is ultimately a logistical issue. I think you underestimate how tired people get when logistical issues are manufactured to move them out of spaces they've used for years. He held her gaze. My son is preparing for a serious competition. His training isn't a hobby. And my daughter's right to use her neighborhood isn't a courtesy. The meeting ended without resolution, which Garrett probably considered a win. But on the walk home, 3 neighbors stopped Nora separately to say they were behind her. Petrosolis said she'd send a written statement to the association. The older man 2 houses down, Marcus Abernathy, said he'd been looking into whether the bracket on the fence post constituted unauthorized modification of shared property. It wasn't nothing, but it also wasn't enough. Not yet. Damon found Nora outside on Friday afternoon. She was carrying groceries from the car, 2 bags at a time, and he materialized at the edge of the driveway like he'd been waiting for her to be alone. He was in his training gear, compression pants, a dry-fit shirt, gloves clipped to his waistband. His arms were crossed, but loosely, the way people stood when they wanted to look casual and managed to look the opposite. Heard you had a lot to say at the meeting, he said. Nora set a bag down. I said what was accurate. My dad thinks you're making things harder than they need to be. Your dad could have solved this in 30 seconds by asking instead of claiming. Damon moved a step closer. He wasn't threatening, exactly, just inhabiting more space than the conversation required. You're a nurse, right? At Harmon Valley General? You said that before. Just making sure I have it right. He smiled, not warmly. My dad's firm does some commercial work in that part of town. He knows some of the board members. Nora looked at him steadily. Is that relevant? I'm just saying. He tilted his head. People who make a lot of noise about small things sometimes find out they've created problems in places they didn't expect. She held the eye contact for a moment. Then she picked up her bag. Thanks for the conversation, she said, and walked inside. She set the groceries down on the counter. She stood at the sink for a moment with both hands flat on the porcelain and breathed. Then she called the hospital's HR department and asked casually whether there had been any recent communications from outside the hospital about staffing matters. The HR coordinator sounded surprised by the question. Not that I'm aware of. Should I flag anything specific? Just keep me in the loop if anything unusual comes through, Nora said. Thank you. She hung up and looked at her hands. She was not afraid. She had stood in places where fear was the only rational response and learned to function anyway. But she knew what this was now. The Calloways weren't just going to annoy her into backing down. They were going to try to cost her something real. She needed to think. The block cleanup was scheduled for the last Saturday of October. It was the neighborhood's annual event. Everyone came out, cleaned up the common areas, did minor repairs, shared food. It was the kind of thing that functioned as social glue, and people took it seriously because there wasn't much else on the block that brought everyone together. Nora had helped organize it for 3 years running. The Calloways showed up. Garrett arrived with a check made out to the neighborhood association for $500, which he presented to the organizer loudly enough that 6 people heard it. It was the kind of gesture that reframed everything. Suddenly, he was a generous new neighbor, not a man who had spent weeks trying to displace a community from shared space. Damon arrived in his training gear, which was a choice, and spent 20 minutes demonstrating techniques to a group of kids who gathered around him. He was good with them, patient even. Nora watched this and felt the complicated irritation of someone who recognized that a person could be charming and still be wrong. Cora appeared at Nora's elbow. Why is he being nice? Audience, Nora said. Is it working? Nora looked around. A few of the neighbors were softening. She could see it. A little. That's annoying. Yes. The afternoon went well enough. Food appeared from multiple houses, kids ran around, someone brought a speaker and played music that nobody objected to. Nora helped clear branches from the far end of the green space and found a rhythm to the work that settled something in her chest that had been wound tight for 2 weeks. She was stacking branches when she heard Cora's voice shift. Not the words. She couldn't hear the words from where she was. But she could hear the tone. Cora was 13, and she had a voice that went very controlled and slightly higher when she was upset and trying not to show it. Nora recognized it instantly, the way she would recognize her own name. She turned around. Damon was standing near the concrete pad. Cora was in front of him, not backing up, which was her daughter in full. She never backed up, even when she should. Other kids were nearby. The adults in the immediate area were watching in that non-watching way people did when they weren't sure if they should intervene. Nora walked over. She got close enough to hear before they noticed her. "Science project again," Cora was saying. "You know what it's like to actually need to get something done. You've got a mouth on you," Damon said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Must be genetic." Nora stepped into the space between them. "Hey, Cora," she said, keeping her voice even. "Go help Petra with the bin bags." Cora opened her mouth. "Please," Nora said. Cora went. Nora turned to Damon. Around them, the cleanup had slowed. People were watching without looking like they were watching. "Whatever she said," Nora said, "she's 13. She doesn't get to be a stand-in for any grievance you have with me." Damon looked at her. Something had changed in him since the driveway conversation, so the looseness was gone. He was holding himself the way he probably held himself before competition. "You want to know what I told her?" he said. "I want you to leave her alone. She came at me first. Apparently she's got something to prove. She's a kid. Whatever's between you and me, she's not part of it." He smiled slowly. "What is between you and me, Nora? Because from where I'm standing, you filed a noise complaint, stirred up the neighborhood meeting, and now you're in my face at a community event. That's a lot of energy for someone who just wants peace. I want fairness." "Fairness." He repeated the word like he was trying it out. "You know what's funny? You walk around here like you've got something on us, like you know something everyone else doesn't." "I just know what's right. You're a nurse," he said. "You hand out meds and follow orders from doctors all day. I respect that. But out here," he gestured broadly, taking in the yard and the street and everything. "You don't have a title. You don't have a rank. You're just a single mom in a rental who decided to pick a fight with my family." The words sat in the air. Nora didn't move. She was aware of exactly who was within earshot. She was aware of Cora, 30 feet away, pretending to help with the bin bags while watching everything. "What I am," Nora said, "is someone who will not stop." Damon studied her. "That's almost impressive." "I mean it seriously. Whatever you're planning, whatever your dad is planning, I won't stop." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then his hand came up and touched her shoulder, just a contact, not violent, but deliberate, just enough to make a point. "Be careful," he said. He walked away. Nora stood still. She could feel the stairs without seeing them. She could feel the way the afternoon had shifted, the way a sunny afternoon could shift when something moved through the air that didn't belong there. She looked down at her shoulder where his hand had been, and then looked up at the houses lining Cedar Line Drive, the porches and the yards, and the windows where she could see shapes moving behind curtains. 4 years she had built something here. 4 years of steady, quiet life. She thought about what it had cost to get here. Not money. The other kind. She thought about what she was being asked to give up. She picked up her work gloves from where she'd set them on a stump and went back to clearing branches, because the work wasn't done. And she had never been someone who left work undone. But something had shifted in her too. She could feel it. A slow turn, like a dial that had been resting at 0 and was just starting to move. Not toward anger. That wasn't quite right. Toward clarity. The letter arrived on Monday morning. It was from Harmon Valley General's Administration Office. Formal, clean typeface, 2 paragraphs. It explained that the hospital was conducting a routine review of nursing staff credentials and scheduling, and that during this process, Nora's overnight shift assignment had been placed under administrative review. She was asked to report to HR on Wednesday. She read it twice. She set it on the kitchen table and made Cora's lunch. She drove Cora to school. She came home, sat at the kitchen table, and read it a 3rd time. The letter said, "Routine review." Nora had worked at Harmon Valley General for 3 years without a single formal complaint. Her last performance evaluation had been marked exceeds expectations in 4 of 5 categories. She had never been to HR for anything other than paperwork. Routine review. She picked up her phone and called a number she hadn't dialed in over 2 years. It rang 4 times. "Voss," said the voice on the other end, gruff, familiar, unhurried. "It's been a while." "It has," she said. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." "When have I not been?" "Do you still have contacts in commercial development oversight, the kind that watch for pressure campaigns on mid-level institutions?" A pause. "That's an interesting question. It's becoming a relevant one." Another pause, longer. "What's going on?" Nora looked at the letter on the table. "Someone's trying to move me off the board," she said, "and I need to know how far it's gone before I decide what to do about it." The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then, "Send me what you have. Give me 48 hours. She took a photo of the letter and texted it. Then she stood up, put on her jacket, and drove to the hospital to make sure she still had a job. She did. For now. The HR coordinator said the review was just process and couldn't say who had initiated it, which told Nora exactly what she needed to know. She drove home on roads she had driven 1,000 times, past the hospital and the shopping district and the elementary school where Cora had gone before middle school, and she let herself feel for exactly 3 minutes the full weight of what was happening. Then she put it away. She'd been in worse positions than this, much worse. The difference was, in those positions, she'd had a team, rules of engagement, a chain of command that made the boundaries clear. Here, she had a rental house, a 13-year-old, and the slowly building certainty that Garrett Calloway had made a fundamental error in judgment. He had assumed, because she was quiet, that she had nothing. He didn't know what she'd buried. He didn't know that the reason she'd stopped fighting wasn't because she couldn't. She pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. From the side yard, she could hear the rhythmic thud of Damon's heavy bag, the crack of impact, the controlled exhale that followed each combination. He was good. She'd watched enough to know that. Disciplined footwork, fast hands, conditioned body. She listened to it for a moment. Then she got out of the car and went inside to start dinner. The dial had moved again. She could feel where it was pointing now. And for the first time since the Calloways arrived on Cedar Line Drive, Nora Voss was no longer thinking about how to protect her peace. She was thinking about what came after that. That night she cooked pasta because it was the one thing she could make without thinking, and not thinking was what she needed. Cora sat across from her at the kitchen table, pushing noodles around her plate in the way she did when something was bothering her that she hadn't decided how to say yet. Nora let the silence sit. She'd learned, over 13 years of raising this particular person, that Cora didn't respond well to being drawn out. She came out when she was ready. "Are we going to have to move?" Cora asked. Nora looked up. "No. Because of the hospital thing." "How do you know about the hospital thing?" "I heard you on the phone this morning." Cora set her fork down. "You didn't close the kitchen door all the way." Nora sat back. She considered lying and decided against it because Cora always knew, and it always made things worse. "There's a review happening. It's probably nothing." "You don't think it's nothing." "I think it's something that can be handled." "By who?" "By me." Nora held her daughter's gaze. "I need you to trust me on this one." Cora looked at her for a long moment. That particular look she had, steady and searching, that sometimes made Nora feel like the teenager in the room. "Is this because of them?" "I don't know yet." "But you think so?" "Cora." "I'm not a little kid, Mom. You can just say it." Nora exhaled. "Yes, I think so, and I'm handling it." Cora picked her fork back up. She didn't say anything else, but the way she ate after that, quieter, more deliberate, told Nora that her daughter was filing the information somewhere and making her own calculations. She had always done that. Even at 6, she'd done it. Nora used to think it was something she'd passed down accidentally, the constant internal risk assessment, the habit of reading a room for exits before she sat down in it. She hoped, not for the first time, that it would serve Cora better than it had served her. After dinner, she went to her bedroom and opened her laptop and spent 2 hours going through everything she had. The association letters, the noise complaint case number, the HR letter, Damon's comment about his father's connections to the board. She typed it all into a document in chronological order, not because she was sure she'd need it, but because organizing information had always helped her think. In another life, she'd done it for mission briefings. She'd been good at it. She'd been good at a lot of things she didn't use anymore. At 11:30, she got a text from the number she'd called that morning. Just 4 words, deeper than you thought. She stared at it for a moment, then set the phone face down on the nightstand and tried to sleep. She managed about 4 hours. Wednesday came gray and cold. Nora drove to the hospital in the kind of early morning dark that made everything feel provisional, like the day hadn't fully committed to existing yet. She'd put on her good blazer, not her work clothes, the blazer, because she'd learned years ago that the clothes you wore to these things sent a message before you opened your mouth. And she wanted the message to be that she was taking this seriously without appearing rattled. HR was on the 3rd floor, tucked behind the billing department in a cluster of offices with frosted glass doors. The coordinator who met her was a woman named Sylvia Marsh, mid-40s, efficient manner, carefully neutral expression. They shook hands and sat across from each other at a small table. "Thank you for coming in," Sylvia said, opening a folder. "As I mentioned, this is a routine administrative review of overnight nursing allocations." "You mentioned that in the letter," Nora said. "What triggered it?" Sylvia glanced at the folder. The review was flagged internally as part of a broader restructuring conversation the administration is having about overnight staffing. Was it flagged by someone internally, or was there an external request? A brief pause. "I'm not in a position to speak to that specifically." "Is the review targeting one position or multiple?" "Multiple positions are being assessed." "Am I the only one called in this week?" Another pause, slightly longer. "I'm scheduling these over the course of the month." Nora nodded slowly. She looked at the folder without trying to read it upside down. "Sylvia, I want to be straightforward with you. I've worked here for 3 years. My record is clean. No complaints, no incidents, no disciplinary flags. Whatever this review is, I want to understand who initiated it and on what basis." Sylvia looked at her with an expression that had shifted slightly. Still professional, but something had loosened at the edges. "I can tell you that the review is currently preliminary and no action is being considered at this stage. But it could lead to action. All reviews have the potential to result in recommendations." Nora folded her hands on the table. "If I submitted a formal request for the initiation documentation, who requested the review and when, what would happen?" Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "That request would go through administrative channels and take time to process." "How much time?" "Weeks, possibly longer." Nora looked at her. Sylvia looked back. Something moved behind the coordinator's eyes. Not quite sympathy, but something close enough to matter. The recognition of one person watching another understand exactly what was being done to them. "Okay," Nora said. She stood, shook Sylvia's hand again. "Thank you for the meeting." She was in the elevator before she let herself process it fully. The review had been initiated externally. Sylvia hadn't confirmed it, but she hadn't denied it either, and people in administrative positions communicated a great deal through what they didn't deny. Garrett Calloway, or someone in his orbit, had reached into a hospital and flagged a nurse who'd annoyed him. It was petty, it was precise, and it was exactly the kind of thing that could quietly dismantle a life if nobody noticed it happening in time. She got in her car and sat in the parking garage for 3 minutes doing the breathing exercise she'd learned in a different life. 4 counts in, hold, 4 out. Not because she was panicking, but because she needed her head completely clear for what came next. Then she drove to see Marcus Abernathy. Marcus had been a judge. Retired now, 71 years old, with a vegetable garden in his backyard that he tended with more seriousness than most people gave their careers. He'd lived on Cedarline Drive for over 20 years and knew its rhythms, the way people knew things they'd paid attention to for a long time, slowly, thoroughly, without drama. He was also, as Nora had discovered 2 years ago, at a block cleanup when someone's kid had been injured and she'd had to explain her decisions to 3 panicking adults at once. One of the few people on the street who could hear something difficult and not react before he'd finished processing it. She found him in the garden despite the cold, turning soil along the edge of a raised bed. He looked up when she came through the gate and read her face in one pass. "Come inside," he said. They sat at his kitchen table with coffee she didn't really want, and she laid it out for him. The bracket on the fence post, the noise complaints, the association meeting, the driveway conversation with Damon, and then the HR letter. She told it in order without editorializing, the way she'd learned to brief. When she finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment, turning his mug in his hands. "You think Garrett Calloway contacted someone on the hospital board," he said. It was not a question. His son implied it directly, and the timing is too clean. "You have anything documented?" "I have the letter. I have timestamps on the noise complaints. I have my account of the conversations." "Anyone who witnessed the side yard incident with Cora?" "Petra Solis was nearby, and 2 other kids." Marcus nodded slowly. "The bracket on the post is potentially actionable if the post sits on shared or ambiguous property. I can pull the original lot surveys from the county records office. I still have access through some old contacts." He paused. "What are you actually asking me for, Nora? Legal strategy or something else?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I need to know if what they're doing rises to the level where outside intervention is appropriate, or if I'm building a case out of grievances that look smaller on paper than they feel." "Tell me about the HR situation again. More slowly this time." She did. He listened the way judges listen, with stillness, letting things accumulate weight before he assessed them. When she finished the second time, he said, "If an outside party used a board connection to initiate a staffing review with no documented cause, that's not a small thing. That's institutional leverage being weaponized for personal retaliation. That's potentially actionable on 2 fronts, employment law and ethics violations." He looked at her directly. "You'd need documentation." "I know. And you'd need someone who can move faster than the administrative channels they're using to slow you down." "I'm working on that." He studied her. "The person you called Monday morning." She didn't answer, which was its own answer. He sat back. "I'll pull the lot surveys today, and I'll put together a written account of the noise disruptions from my end. Delphine will too, if I ask her." His wife, if Nora knew, had complained about the early morning sessions more than once. "Whatever you're building, you'll want neighbors on record." "Thank you, Marcus." "Don't thank me yet." He picked up his coffee. "These people have resources and they're not afraid to use them. Whatever you're planning, you need it to be airtight before it moves." She nodded. "That's why I'm being careful." He gave her a long look over his mug. "Are you?" She met his eyes. "Yes." He didn't look entirely convinced, but he didn't push it. That was one of the things she appreciated about him. The contact she'd called Monday morning was a man named Ray Tulloch. He had been her unit's intelligence liaison for 2 years during her last deployment, which meant he had spent those 2 years in a gray zone between official military channels and the kind of informal networks that technically didn't exist on any org chart but functioned with more efficiency than anything official. He was now nominally retired, which Nora understood to mean he did the same work for different clients through a private consultancy that had a deliberately vague website and no social media presence. He called her Thursday evening while she was sitting in the hospital parking lot after her shift, which had been tense in the particular way that workplaces became tense when everyone knew something was happening, but nobody would say it directly. 2 of her colleagues had been oddly quiet with her. Her charge nurse had avoided eye contact during handoff. The atmosphere had the specific texture of people waiting to see which way something fell before they picked a side. "The Calloway firm," Ray said without preamble. "Garrett Calloway. I've been through his commercial portfolio for the last 4 years. And? He's got 3 active development contracts in Harmon Valley. 2 are straightforward. The third one is interesting." She could hear him pulling something up. "There's a mixed-use development project, residential and commercial, on the east side of the city. It's been stalled in zoning approval for 14 months. The holdup is a community health impact assessment that requires sign-off from a regional medical authority." Nora was very still. "Which regional medical authority?" "The one that includes Harmon Valley General on its oversight board." She exhaled slowly. "So Garrett Calloway has a stalled $14 million development that's being held up by a board that includes the hospital where I work." "Correct. And he's been building relationships on that board for the better part of a year. Dinners, donations, the usual." Ray paused. "I don't have a direct line connecting his board contact to your HR review, but the timing fits, and the mechanism is there." "It's not just about the yard," Nora said. "No. I think annoying him made you a useful chip. If he can demonstrate that he has reach into the institution, if he can show the board contact he can move things, that's leverage. Getting a nurse reviewed isn't the point. Proving he can do it is. She stared through the windshield at the hospital's parking structure. He's using me to send a message to someone else. That's my read. Can you document it? I can document the development project, the board relationships, and the timeline. The direct connection is harder. You'd need someone on the inside of that conversation, or a paper trail from the HR initiation. Nora thought of Sylvia Marsh and the careful way she hadn't answered certain questions. I might be able to get the paper trail. If you can, send it to me. I know a few people who watch for this specific pattern, private influence campaigns on public adjacent institutions. If it's what it looks like, this isn't the first time he's done it. She absorbed that. Other places. Other people. Harmon Valley isn't his first market. He's done this in 2 other cities. There were complaints both times. Nothing stuck because nobody connected the pattern. She sat in the car for another minute after she hung up. The hospital loomed behind her, concrete and lit windows, and the distant sound of an ambulance pulling into the bay on the far side of the building. She had spent 3 years in those halls. She had held people's hands while they died in those halls. She had run codes and made calls and carried weight that most people never saw because that was the work. And she had always just done the work. And somewhere, in a boardroom she'd never been in, Garrett Calloway had used her as a pawn in a zoning dispute. She started the car. The dial had moved again. All the way now. The following week unraveled in a way that felt both slow and sudden, the way things did when multiple threads started pulling at once. Marcus produced the lot surveys on Friday and confirmed that the fence post where Damon had installed the bracket sat precisely on the shared property line, not the Calloway side, not exclusively, which meant the modification had been made to shared infrastructure without consent. He sent a formal written objection to the neighborhood association with a copy to the city's property standards office, citing the specific municipal code that governed modifications to boundary structures. Petrosolis submitted a written noise complaint with timestamps covering 11 separate incidents. She'd been keeping a log, which surprised Nora, and then didn't, because Petra was the kind of person who prepared for things without announcing it. The city responded to Nora's original noise complaint with a formal notice to the Calloway household. Not a resolution, just an acknowledgement that the complaint was active and that further violations could result in fines. It was a small thing, but small things accumulated. On Saturday, Damon was out in the side yard when the city inspector came to assess the bracket. Nora watched from her kitchen window as Damon spoke to the inspector with his arms crossed, and that particular smile that he deployed when he wanted to seem reasonable but hadn't quite gotten there. The inspector measured. The inspector photographed. The inspector left without saying much, which meant the determination was still pending, which meant the bracket was in a holding pattern, not removed, but not validated either. Damon saw Nora in the window. He held the eye contact for a moment, then went back inside. That afternoon, Nora got a text from an unknown number. It said, "You should think about whether this is worth it." She screenshotted it and added it to her file. The piece she hadn't anticipated came on Tuesday, from a direction she hadn't been watching. Cora came home from school quieter than usual, dropped her bag at the door, and went straight to the kitchen for a glass of water, which she drank standing at the counter with her back to the room. Nora was at the table with her laptop and recognized the posture immediately. "Talk to me," Nora said. Cora set the glass down. "Someone at school said something." "What kind of something?" "About you." She turned around. Her jaw was set in the way it got when she was working to stay controlled and not entirely succeeding. "A girl in my class, her dad apparently knows Mr. Calloway. They do business together or something. She came up to me at lunch and said her dad told her that our neighbor is having my mom investigated for faking her nursing credentials." The kitchen was very quiet. "That you got your license somehow without actually completing the requirements," Cora continued. "That the hospital is going to find out and fire you." Nora kept her face still. "That's not true." "I know it's not true." Cora's voice cracked slightly at the edges, the first sign. "But she said it in front of like 6 people, Mom. She said it like it was already decided, like it was gossip, except it wasn't gossip, it was a message. It was for me to hear." Nora stood up. She crossed the kitchen and put her hands on Cora's shoulders and waited until her daughter looked at her directly. "Listen to me," she said. "My credentials are real. My record is real. There is nothing they can find because there is nothing there. Do you understand?" Then why are they saying it? Because they want us scared. They want us to back down. She held her daughter's gaze. Are you scared? Cora's jaw worked for a moment. Then, I'm angry. Good. Nora let go of her shoulders. Stay angry. It's cleaner. Cora wiped her eye with the back of her hand and seemed annoyed at herself for doing it. What are you going to do? Something I should have done a week ago, Nora said. She went to her bedroom and called Ray Tulloch. She told him about the school incident in 3 sentences. He was quiet for a moment. They're running a reputation campaign. That's escalation. That means they feel the pressure. Or they want to shut it down before it gets worse for them. Both things can be true. A pause. Nora, these people are not going to stop on their own. They don't have a mechanism for that. In my experience, the only thing that stops someone like Garrett Calloway is something that costs him more than the fight is worth. What would that be? Public exposure of the pattern. If someone connects the dots across his previous markets, and this one, the influence campaigns, the board relationships, the HR pressure, it becomes a story. And stories are expensive. Who would connect those dots? I can put together a package, data, timelines, documented connections, but it needs to go to the right people. Investigative journalists, regulatory bodies, maybe federal commerce oversight depending on how the board influence is structured. He paused again. And it needs a local anchor, someone who's been inside the situation and can speak to it directly. Nora was quiet for a long moment. That would mean going public. Yes. She sat on the edge of her bed, through the wall. She could hear Cora moving around in her room, the sound of a textbook hitting the floor, a drawer opening, the ordinary sounds of a 13-year-old pretending everything was fine. She thought about 4 years of quiet. She thought about what it had cost to build it and what it would cost to use it as a shield when a kid was getting ambushed at lunch over her mother's fictional sins. Put the package together, she said. I'll handle the local anchor. How long do you need? She thought about Marcus, about Petra, about Sylvia Marsh's careful non-answers, about the lot survey and the noise logs and the screenshotted text from an unknown number. A week, she said. Maybe less. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of her bedroom, the afternoon light going orange through the curtains, and she let herself feel the full shape of what was coming. Not the fear. She wasn't afraid, but the weight of it. The knowledge that moving forward meant things would get harder before they got easier, that there was no version of this that didn't cost something. She had made this calculation before in places where the stakes were measured in different currency. She knew how to do it. She just hadn't thought she'd have to do it again on Cedar Line Drive. On Thursday evening, Garrett Calloway knocked on her door. He was alone, which was unusual. No folder this time. He was dressed casually, a fleece jacket, slacks, and he had the demeanor of a man who had decided to try a different register, reasonable, almost warm. I thought we should talk, he said, neighbor to neighbor, without the association in the middle. She stepped aside. Come in. He came into her front room and declined to sit, which told her he intended this to be short. He looked around the room with the assessing gaze of someone who evaluated properties by habit, then returned his attention to her. I think things have gotten unnecessarily complicated, he said. I'd like to simplify them. I'm listening. The association process, the complaints, the inspector, it's all generating friction that doesn't benefit anyone. He spread his hands slightly. I'm prepared to have the bracket removed. Damon will adjust his training schedule to reasonable hours, and I'll make sure the administrative review at the hospital is closed out as a non-issue. Nora looked at him. You'll make sure it's closed out. A small pause. These things have a way of resolving when the right people aren't interested in pursuing them. So you're telling me you can stop something that you just admitted you started? His expression didn't change. I'm telling you that I want to resolve this. In exchange for what? In exchange for things going back to normal. You go back to your life, we get on with ours, and the neighborhood stops having to choose sides. She studied him. He was good. The packaging was nearly perfect. The right tone, the right framing, just enough admission to seem honest without actually being honest. She could see why it had worked in other places, with other people. And the noise at my daughter's school, she said? The story about my credentials? Something moved across his face, quickly contained, but there. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Then let me be clear. Her voice was level, completely level. Your son's girlfriend's father's business partner's daughter told my 13-year-old at lunch that I'm being investigated for credential fraud in front of 6 people. That's a specific enough detail that I'm sure you can trace how it got there. He was quiet. I'm not interested in your offer, she said, because what you're describing isn't a resolution, it's a reset. Everything you've built against me stays built. The relationships, the channels, the mechanisms. You just agree not to use them for a while. And the next time something inconveniences you, you use them again. That's exactly what it is. She walked to the front door and opened it. I want documentation that the HR review has been formally closed and the reason recorded. I want the bracket off the fence post within 5 days per the Property Standards Office timeline. And I want Damon's training restricted to the hours the city noise ordinance actually allows. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. Not a threat. Something more like a statement of fact, which was almost worse. Maybe, she said, but it's mine to make. He left without another word. She closed the door and stood in her front hallway with her back against it and breathed. Her hands were completely steady. She noticed this the way she noticed things she'd trained herself to monitor. Her own physiological state, the gap between what her body was doing and what the situation called for. She was steady. She was clear. She was also, for the first time since all of this started, completely certain that she had just crossed a line from which there was no quiet retreat. Garrett Calloway walked to his car without looking back. He got in. He sat there for a moment before starting the engine, long enough that she was still watching from the window when he finally pulled out. She didn't know yet what he was going to do next. But 2 days later, at 6:15 on a Saturday morning, she found out. There was a folded letter wedged into her front door handle. No envelope, no postage. The letterhead was from a law firm she'd never heard of. It stated, in precise legal language, that the Calloway family was initiating a formal harassment claim against Nora Voss, citing her involvement in a coordinated campaign of complaints designed to disadvantage their clients, and that they would be seeking an injunction preventing her from filing further complaints against the Calloway household pending the outcome of the claim. She read it standing on the porch in the cold, in the clothes she'd slept in, while the early morning light turned the street gold around her. An injunction. If it went through, she couldn't file. She couldn't complain. She couldn't use any of the official channels she'd been carefully building for 3 weeks. She looked at the letter for a long moment, then she took a photo of it, sent it to Ray Tulloch and Marcus Abernathy, went inside, and made coffee. Her phone rang before the coffee was done. It was a number she didn't recognize, a 703 area code, which she placed after a moment as Northern Virginia. She picked up. Is this Nora Voss? The voice was female, precise, unhurried. My name is Agent Delia Farrow. I'm with the Federal Commerce Integrity Division. I've been reviewing some materials that were submitted to our office regarding a pattern of institutional interference in Harmon Valley, and your name came up as a direct affected party. A brief pause. I was hoping we could meet. Nora set her coffee mug down very carefully. Yes, she said. When? Agent Delia Farrow drove a dark blue sedan that looked like every government vehicle Nora had ever seen. Clean, anonymous, chosen to disappear in traffic. She pulled up to Cedarline Drive at 9:15 on Saturday morning and parked 2 houses down, which Nora noticed and appreciated. No announcement, no theater. Farrow was somewhere in her early 40s, medium height, with the kind of posture that came from years of sitting in rooms where you couldn't afford to look tired even when you were. She wore a gray jacket and carried a slim leather portfolio, and she shook Nora's hand at the door with a grip that was firm without performing firmness. Thank you for making time, she said. I cleared my morning, Nora said. Come in. They sat at the kitchen table. Farrow declined coffee, which told Nora she didn't intend to stay long, or didn't want to create the atmosphere of a long conversation. She opened the portfolio and set 3 printed pages on the table. Not for Nora to read, just present, a visual anchor. How much did Ray Tulloch tell you about our office? Farrow asked. That you monitor patterns of private influence on public-adjacent institutions. He said Garrett Calloway's name came up in connection with something broader. That's accurate. Farrow settled back slightly. The Federal Commerce Integrity Division was stood up 18 months ago, specifically to track what we call soft pressure campaigns. Private actors using relationship networks to manipulate permitting, regulatory, and institutional decisions without crossing into outright bribery. It's a gray zone that's been very difficult to prosecute because no single action is illegal on its own. It's the pattern that matters. And Calloway is a pattern. Calloway Meridian Development has operated in 4 metro areas in the last 6 years. In each case, they entered a market with stalled projects. In each case, within 12 to 18 months of arrival, there were documented instances of community members who opposed or inconvenienced their interests experiencing professional disruptions, HR reviews, licensing flags, zoning objections filed against them personally. Farrow's voice was even, methodical. 2 people lost jobs. 1 lost a small business license after a sudden inspection. All cases unconnected on the surface. Nora was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? Your HR review is the most recent instance in our timeline. If we can document the mechanism, how the contact was made, who initiated the flag at the hospital, and what relationship that person has to Calloway's board network, it closes a gap we've been trying to close for 8 months. Farrow looked at her directly. I also need to know if you'd be willing to be a named witness in a federal inquiry, if it reaches that stage. What stage is it at now? Preliminary. We're building toward a referral to the Commerce Department's Enforcement Division. That process takes time. She paused. I want to be honest with you. This isn't something that resolves in a week. If you go on record, you're committing to a process that could run 6 months or longer. Nora looked at the 3 pages on the table, still face up, but too far to read easily. And in the meantime, there's a harassment injunction being filed against me that could shut down my ability to file local complaints. Farrow nodded. I saw the letter. It's aggressive. It's also likely to fail. It's overreaching, and any competent judge will see that. But the filing alone will cost you time and energy. She paused. Unless the injunction is filed in a court where Calloway has existing relationships. Does he? We're looking into that. Nora sat with that for a moment. She looked out the kitchen window at the side yard. The heavy bag was there, hanging from the bracket on the fence post that the inspector had photographed but not yet ordered removed. The morning was still and cold, and there was nobody out there. My daughter got targeted at school, Nora said. 13 years old. Someone spread a story about my credentials through a social chain that went from Calloway to a business partner to a school parent to my daughter's classmate. She turned back to Farrow. Can that be part of the pattern documentation? Farrow made a note. Yes. Social reputation campaigns targeting family members of the primary subject. That's been a feature in 2 of the other cases. It fits. Then, yes, Nora said. I'll be a named witness. Farrow nodded once, with the measured acknowledgement of someone who had learned not to show relief professionally. I'll need everything you've documented. Letters, timestamps, the text from the unknown number, your account of the conversations. Everything. I'll have it to you by end of day. One more thing. Farrow closed her portfolio. This conversation needs to stay between us for now. If Calloway becomes aware of federal interest, he may accelerate whatever he's planning, or he may try to negotiate terms before anything is filed. Either option complicates the case. Understood, Nora said. Farrow stood, shook her hand again, and left the same way she'd arrived, quietly, without fuss, the sedan pulling out and disappearing around the corner in under a minute. Nora stood at her front window and watched the street settle back into Saturday morning stillness. Then she went to her laptop and started building the document package. She spent 4 hours on it. She was thorough in the particular way she'd been trained to be thorough. Not exhaustive, not padded, but complete. Every date, every exchange, every document in chronological order with a 1-line notation explaining its relevance. When she was done, it was 41 pages, and she sent it to Farrow's secure email address with a red receipt. Then she went to pick up Cora from her friend's house and spent the afternoon doing nothing in particular. Grocery store, a walk through the park 2 blocks over where the trees had gone full November bare, a slow dinner that neither of them rushed. She didn't tell Cora about Farrow. She wasn't ready to explain what it meant, and she needed Cora to have at least a few more days of ordinary life before the weight of it became unavoidable. That evening, Marcus called. The Property Standards Office came back, he said. The bracket is classified as an unauthorized modification to a shared boundary structure. The Calloways have been formally notified they have 10 business days to remove it or the city will remove it at their expense. It was the first clean win. Small, procedural, but documented. Good, Nora said. There's something else. His voice shifted slightly. I heard from a woman named Sylvia Marsh this afternoon, HR coordinator at Harmon Valley General. Nora went still. She called you? She called the neighborhood association line, which forwards to me after hours. She said she had information relevant to a property dispute on Cedar Line Drive, which is how she framed it. I'm not sure how she found the connection. A pause. She said she wanted to speak to the affected party directly, not through the hospital. She's going around her own administration, Nora said. That's my reading. Give me her number. She called Sylvia Marsh from the back porch in the cold, while Cora watched something on her tablet inside. Sylvia picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. Mrs. Voss, Sylvia said, I wasn't sure if you'd call. What do you have? A breath. Then, the HR review. I can't give you the formal initiation documents. I don't have that authority, and doing so would be a clear violation. But I can tell you that the request came in through a board member named Philip Wardell. And I can tell you that Wardell has been to 2 Calloway Meridian fundraising events in the last 8 months, which I know because the invitations went through the hospital's community relations office, and I processed that correspondence. Nora pressed the phone harder against her ear. Philip Wardell initiated the review. He called the chief nursing officer directly and suggested the review as part of what he characterized as routine due diligence on staffing quality. The CNO flagged it to HR as a board member concern, which is why it moved as fast as it did. Another breath. I've been in this job for 11 years. I've never seen a board member call in a staffing review for a single nurse with a clean record. It's not how this works. Why are you telling me this? The pause this time was longer. Because I have a kid too, Sylvia said, and because what happened to you isn't right, and because if I were you, I'd want someone to tell me. Nora looked at the dark backyard, the bare tree at the far end, the yellow light from a neighbor's window beyond the fence. The name Philip Wardell. You're comfortable with me using that? I'm comfortable with it. What you do with it is your decision. Thank you, Sylvia. Don't thank me. Just handle it. She hung up and stood in the cold for another minute. Then she went inside and sent Ray Tulloch one text. Philip Wardell, Hospital Board, Calloway Connection, confirm and document. His reply came back in 6 minutes. Already in the file, we have him at 2 events. Working on financial records. The mechanism was closing. She could feel it. The shape of the case tightening from a set of separate grievances into something with structure, with documented connections, with the kind of institutional weight that didn't dissolve when a wealthy man decided to apply pressure. She slept 6 hours that night, which was better than she'd managed in 2 weeks. Sunday brought the first real mistake, and it was Damon's. Nora was in the side yard at 10 in the morning, doing exactly what she was entitled to do, working on the raised garden bed she'd been planning since September, turning soil and laying down the winter cover she'd bought at the hardware store. It was quiet work, and she was doing it methodically, with earbuds in, which meant she didn't hear Damon come out until he was already standing at the edge of the concrete pad. She pulled one earbud out. He was in his training gear. He looked at her, then at the garden bed, then back at her. You're in the middle of my space. I'm in the shared yard, she said. I'm not on the pad. You've got gear spread out across the whole area. I've got a tarp and a bag of compost. She looked at him steadily. The bracket notice came through, by the way. 10 days. Something tightened in his face. My dad's lawyer is filing a response. They can file whatever they want. She put her earbud back in. He stepped forward and kicked the bag of compost off the concrete edge. It wasn't hard. It wasn't violent, exactly. But it was deliberate. A controlled, contemptuous kick that sent the bag sliding 2 feet and spilled a corner of compost across the grass. She pulled both earbuds out. She stood up. She was not particularly tall, and Damon had 6 inches and 60 pounds on her, and he was trained, and he knew it. And the way he was standing made clear that he knew she knew it. She looked at the compost on the grass. She looked at him. Pick that up, she said. He laughed. Not loudly, just a short exhale of genuine amusement. You're serious? Pick it up, and then go inside, and we don't have to have the rest of this conversation. He crossed his arms. Or what? You file another complaint? Call another inspector? He tilted his head. You know what I think? I think you like the fight. I think you've been looking for an excuse to make this into something bigger than it is because you're bored and you're angry about your life and we're convenient. That's interesting, she said. Is that what you and your dad decided, or did you come up with it yourself? The amusement left his face. I've been watching you. The way you carry yourself. You've got military in you somewhere. I can see it. But whatever you used to be, you're a nurse now. You work nights. You live in a rental. And you are way out of your depth with my family. She said nothing. Whatever you're building, he said, stop. Walk away from it. Because I promise you that when my dad finishes with the legal side, there won't be a complaint, a noise log, or a neighbor's statement that means anything. She looked at him for a long, still moment. Your dad sent you out here, she said. That's interesting. Nobody sent me anywhere. Then this is your own idea, which means you're the one who's going to own it when it becomes part of the documentation. She picked up her earbud. The yard has a camera, by the way, motion activated, has been for 2 years. She watched the information move across his face, the flicker of calculation, the rapid backward review of the last 90 seconds, the landing on what he'd done with the compost bag. She put her earbud back in and went back to her garden. He stood there for another moment. Then he went inside. She waited until the door closed before she let herself exhale. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was elevated. She could feel it, the specific jump that happened when the body anticipated contact and didn't get it. But she was fine. She was completely fine. She checked the camera app on her phone. The footage had recorded cleanly. She sent it to Ray Tulloch with a 3-word message, adding to file. Well, the hearing for the harassment injunction was set for the following Thursday at the county courthouse. Marcus accompanied her, which she hadn't asked for but was grateful for. He wore his good suit and carried a folder of his own, and the bailiff gave him the unconscious deference that people gave to retired judges, even when they didn't know that's what they were. The Calloway's lawyer was a man named Dressler, mid-50s, downtown firm, the kind of attorney who charged enough per hour to make the cost of the injunction itself a form of intimidation. He made his argument efficiently, pattern of complaints constituting harassment, intent to damage the Calloway family's standing in the community, emotional distress. The judge was a woman named Honorable Patricia Vane. She was in her early 60s, with reading glasses she kept taking on and off, and she had the particular patience of someone who had heard every version of every argument and was now only interested in what was actually in front of her. Nora's lawyer, a woman named Genevieve Sato, recommended by Marcus, specializing in civil rights and employment, made a 20-minute counterargument that rested on 3 pillars. The complaints were documented, legitimate, and filed through proper channels. The injunction was an attempt to suppress a private citizen's legal right to use those channels. And there was an ongoing matter that bore on the good faith question of who was actually applying pressure to whom. That last piece made Dressler glance up. Judge Vane looked over her glasses. What ongoing matter? Genevieve was precise. A federal review of a pattern of institutional interference that directly involves the petitioning party and includes the HR review my client received at her place of employment. I'm not in a position to disclose the specifics of that review at this stage, but I can represent to the court that it exists and that the timing of this injunction filing, 3 days after my client declined to accept a settlement offer from Garrett Calloway, is relevant. Dressler objected. The judge overruled him with a patience that bordered on impatience. Counselor, Judge Vane said to Dressler, your client is asking me to prevent a private citizen from filing noise complaints and property standards reports through the city. That's a significant reach. What is the documented harm to your client from these filings? Reputational damage and filed through legal channels? The pattern of, is filing a noise complaint with the city considered harassment in your reading of the relevant statute? Dressler adjusted his approach. He was smooth, Nora gave him that. But Judge Vane had the quality of a person who had been lied to by competent people for decades and had developed a fine instrument for detecting it. The injunction was denied. Not tabled, not modified. Denied, with a notation in the record that the filing appeared to be a strategic use of the court's process rather than a good faith harassment claim. Dressler gathered his papers without expression. The Calloways were not in the courtroom. Garrett had sent his lawyer alone, which Nora had noted when she walked in, and which told her something about how confident he'd been that this would be routine. Outside the courthouse, in the thin November sun, Marcus buttoned his coat and didn't say anything for a moment. "That notation," Nora said. "It's public record," he said. "Yes. Ray can use it. Anyone can use it." He looked at her. "You're doing well. Stay patient." She nodded. Patient was something she knew how to do. She had done it in places where impatience got people killed, and the discipline of it had become structural, built into how she moved through the world. She could wait. She was very good at waiting. What she hadn't anticipated was that Garrett Calloway was not. She got the call at 11:15 on Friday night when she was 40 minutes into her overnight shift at Harmon Valley General. It was Cora's phone, which meant it wasn't Cora's. Cora never called during shift unless something was wrong, and if something was wrong, she texted first, always. Nora stepped into the hallway and picked up. "Cora?" It was a voice she didn't recognize, male, young, slightly breathless. "Is this Nora Voss? I'm Eli. I'm a neighbor. I live 2 houses down from you. I'm here with your daughter." Her whole chest tightened. "Is she hurt?" No, she's okay, but something happened at your house. There was a car and some people, and I think you need to come home." She was already moving. "Tell me exactly what happened." "We were coming back from Petra's, me and Cora and Petra's son, and there were 2 guys in the side yard. They weren't doing anything that obvious, just they had the bracket off the fence post, and they were, I don't know, it looked like they were damaging the garden bed, and one of them had something, Cora said it was a camera, pointed at your house. We didn't confront them. We came inside and called you." "Where's Cora right now?" "She's with me. We're at my place." "Stay there." Her voice was flat and completely even. "Do not go back to my house. I'm leaving now." She told her charge nurse there was a family emergency, handed off her remaining patients in 90 seconds, and was in her car before the explanation was finished. She drove home in 12 minutes on roads that felt too long, her hands correct on the wheel, her mind running through what she knew and what it meant. The bracket had been ordered removed by the city. The Calloways were legally required to do it within 10 days. But the deadline hadn't passed yet. If they'd removed it themselves, tonight, in the dark, with someone photographing her house, that wasn't compliance, that was a setup. Remove the bracket, document the removal, then claim the garden bed damage was caused by something else. Or use the footage for something. She wasn't sure yet what the angle was, but there was an angle, and it was bad enough that Garrett Calloway had sent people to her house at night while she was at work and her daughter was out. She pulled onto Cedar Line Drive and saw it immediately. A car she didn't recognize parked against the curb 3 houses down, lights off. She drove past it without stopping, pulled into her driveway, sat for exactly 4 seconds. Then she called Agent Farrow. It rang twice. "Voss. There are people at my property. I don't know if they're still there. My daughter witnessed them in the side yard with camera equipment. I need this documented tonight." "Are you at the property now?" "Just arrived." "Don't enter the side yard. Get your daughter. Stay visible. I'm making a call." Farrow hung up. Nora got out of her car. The side yard was dark and quiet. She could see the fence post from the driveway. The bracket was gone. The garden bed had been disturbed, a long scrape across the winter cover tarp, soil scattered. Nothing catastrophic, but deliberate. Documentable on their terms, not hers. She walked 2 houses down to where Eli, a college-aged kid she vaguely recognized, opened the door before she knocked. Cora was on the couch with her knees pulled up, looking pale and furious in equal measure. Nora crossed the room and put her hands on her daughter's face and checked her the way she checked patients, eyes, color, breathing. "You're okay," she said. "I'm fine," Cora said. "I'm so angry I can't even talk." "Then don't talk, just stay here for a bit longer." "Mom, they were at our house." "I know." She kept her voice even because Cora needed even right now, not because she felt it. "I'm handling it." Eli was hovering near the door. "I got some of it on my phone. The guy's in the yard. I didn't want to get closer, but I held it up through the window." She turned to him. "Can you send that to me right now?" He did. She forwarded it to Farrow and Ray Tulloch in the same breath. Then she went to the window and looked out at Cedar Line Drive, quiet and still, the unknown car still parked 3 houses down, no movement. She was watching it when the lights came on. Not the car's lights. The house behind the car, Petra Solis's house, lit up in the front room, and then Petra appeared in the window, and then Petra's phone came up, and Nora could see from across the street that she was recording the car. Good, Nora thought. Good. She texted Pharaoh. Unknown vehicle, partial plate, still on scene. Pharaoh's reply came back in under a minute. Local unit is 12 minutes out. Don't engage. Nora set her phone down. She stood in Eli's front room with her daughter on the couch behind her and the whole weight of the last 4 weeks pressing against the back of her sternum. And she was steady. She was clear. She was precise. But she was also, underneath all of it, deeply and specifically angry in a way she hadn't let herself feel since the side yard on cleanup day. They had come to her house. At night. While she was working and her daughter was out. She didn't know yet exactly what they were trying to document or manufacture. She didn't know if Garrett Calloway had been stupid enough to order it directly or if Damon had moved on his own after the injunction failed. She didn't know which version was worse. What she knew was that a line had been crossed that had nothing to do with brackets or noise ordinances or HR reviews. They had made it about Cora. The police cruiser arrived in 11 minutes. Nora met the officers outside, gave her account in clear, ordered sentences, showed them Eli's footage and the camera she'd pulled from her side yard, motion activated, undisturbed, with 4 hours of footage on it that she hadn't reviewed yet. The officers asked her to send the footage to their case email. She did it standing in her driveway in the November cold, in her scrubs, while the cruiser's lights rotated slowly across the fronts of the houses on Cedar Line Drive. She watched the unknown car during all of this. It didn't move. Whoever was in it had decided that moving would be more conspicuous than staying. Then her camera footage loaded on the officer's tablet. He watched 30 seconds of it and turned to his partner. His partner looked at her. "Mrs. Voss," he said carefully, "one of the individuals in this footage, the one near the garden bed, he's wearing a jacket that's got a logo on the back." He held the tablet toward her. "Do you recognize this logo?" She looked at the freeze frame. The logo was a stylized M over 2 horizontal bars. She had seen it before. Not on a jacket, on the website of Calloway Meridian Development, the firm's corporate branding, the same logo that appeared on the signage around their stalled East Side project. She looked at the officer. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who had just watched a misdemeanor property situation become something considerably larger. "I think," she said evenly, "that you should call this in." He was already reaching for his radio when her phone rang again. This time it was a number she recognized, Ray Tulloch. She stepped away from the officers to answer. "Tell me." "Nora." His voice was different, not alarmed exactly, but stripped down to something direct in a way that made her chest tighten. "Pharaoh called me 10 minutes ago. The financial records came back on Philip Wardell, the Calloway board connection. And? It's not just social events. There are payments. Structured payments through 2 shell entities that we can connect to Calloway Meridian with 2 hops. Wardell has been on their payroll for 14 months. A pause. That's not soft influence anymore. That's bribery of a hospital board member. That's a federal crime. She stood on her driveway in the cold, police lights rotating behind her, and processed that for exactly 3 seconds. "When does Pharaoh move?" she asked. "She's talking to her supervisor tonight. If the authorization comes through..." He stopped. "Nora, if this moves to federal enforcement, Garrett Calloway is going to know it's coming before it arrives. These people always find out, and when they find out, they either run or they escalate." She looked back at the unknown car, still sitting 3 houses down with its lights off, someone inside it watching her stand in her own driveway. "He's already escalating," she said. "I know." Ray's voice was tight. "Which means we might be about to find out what he looks like when he's cornered." The police officer touched her elbow. She turned. He had his radio in one hand and his expression had shifted into something that was all business now, the casual Saturday quality completely gone. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "we just ran the partial plate on that vehicle." She waited. "It's registered to a security contracting firm that has a listed address in the same building as Calloway Meridian Development's regional office." She looked at the car. The car sat still. Then the driver's door opened. The man who got out of the car was not what Nora expected. He was in his 30s, unremarkable. Medium build, civilian clothes, the specific kind of forgettable that people in certain professions cultivated deliberately. He held both hands slightly away from his body as he walked toward the officers, which was the gesture of someone who had been in situations with police before and knew the protocols. He identified himself before anyone asked. He had a business card ready. The officer took it, looked at Nora. She couldn't read the card from where she stood, but she watched the officer's face, and that was enough. Whatever the card said, it had shifted something in the dynamic. Not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way a room changed when the wrong person walked into it. The man spoke to the officer for about 90 seconds. She caught fragments: private security, client consultation, routine documentation of a property dispute. Then the officer came back to her. He says his firm was retained by the Calloway family to document the state of the shared property in advance of a legal response to the city's bracket order. The officer's voice was careful, neutral, in the deliberate way. He says they have written authorization from the client. And the people in my garden bed? He says they were documenting the condition of the shared space from the shared space. He says they did not enter your private property. Nora looked at the man by the car. He was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets now, patient, watching the conversation with the mild expression of someone waiting for a bus. The motion camera footage shows one individual's foot crossing the edge of my garden bed, she said, which is on my private property, not the shared pad. The officer nodded slowly. That's something we can assess. I'd like that in writing, she said. Tonight, as part of the incident report. He looked at her for a moment. You know how this works? I do, she said, which is why I'm asking. She got the incident report. It took 40 minutes, and the security contractor stayed until it was done, which told her he'd been instructed to monitor what went into the record. When the officers left, the contractor got back in his car and drove away without looking at her. She went and got Cora. They walked home together in the dark, Cora's shoulder against hers, neither of them speaking until they were inside with the door locked and the porch light on. Are you going to tell me what's actually happening? Cora asked. Yes, Nora said. Tomorrow. Tonight I need you to sleep. I'm not going to sleep. Try anyway. Cora went upstairs. Nora sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and the incident report and the camera footage and didn't sleep at all. By morning, she had watched the footage 11 times, the clearest frame, the one where the contractor's boot crossed the boundary of her garden bed, a distance of approximately 14 inches over the property line. She had exported, time-stamped, and sent to Farrow, Ray Tulloch, Genevieve Sato, and Marcus Abernathy before 6 a.m. Genevieve called at 7:15. Criminal trespass is a stretch given the margin, she said, without preamble. But civil trespass, combined with the context of everything else, absolutely holds. More importantly, this changes the shape of the harassment injunction denial. They filed the injunction, lost it, and then sent contractors to your property within 72 hours. A judge who sees that sequence is going to have questions. Can we file something today? I can file a civil trespass complaint and a motion for protective relief, essentially asking the court to formally prohibit the Calloways from sending representatives onto any portion of your property or shared property without prior written notice. Given the injunction denial record and this footage, I think we get it. Do it, Nora said. She made breakfast. She made it carefully, eggs, toast, the orange juice Cora liked, because keeping ordinary things ordinary was a choice she'd made consciously a long time ago, and she wasn't going to stop now. When Cora came downstairs, she sat her at the table and told her everything. Not a simplified version, the real version, the HR review, Philip Wardell, Ray Tulloch, Agent Farrow, the federal inquiry, the payment records, the injunction, and the contractors in the yard. Cora listened without interrupting, which was unusual. She ate her eggs. When Nora finished, Cora looked at the table for a moment. How long have you known all of this? She asked. The federal piece, a week. The rest has been building since the beginning. And you didn't tell me because you're 13 and I wanted to protect you from it for as long as I could. She held her daughter's gaze. I'm telling you now because you're past the point where not knowing is actually protecting you. Cora was quiet for another moment. Then, the federal thing, the bribery. If that goes through, what happens to them? Philip Wardell loses his board seat at minimum, faces criminal charges at the federal level. Nora wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. Garrett Calloway. If they can connect the payments to him directly, and Ray thinks they can. Federal bribery charges, potential civil penalties. and the development project gets frozen pending investigation. And Damon? Nora considered that. Damon is a separate question. Cora looked out the kitchen window at the side yard. The disturbed garden bed was visible from here, the tarp scraped back, dark soil exposed. He's not going to just sit there while all that happens to his dad. No, Nora agreed. He's not. She didn't say what she thought Damon might do, because she didn't know yet, and saying it without knowing it would only make Cora more anxious. But she had been thinking about it since the car drove away last night. Garrett Calloway operated through channels: legal, institutional, procedural. Those channels were closing. When channels closed on men like Garrett, they sometimes made the same mistake their sons made and decided that direct was better. She didn't think Garrett was that impulsive. She wasn't as sure about Damon. The civil trespass complaint was filed by 10 a.m. By noon, Genevieve had a preliminary hearing scheduled for the following Tuesday and had received a call from Dressler, the Calloway's attorney, asking to discuss terms. He used the word discuss, Genevieve reported. Not negotiate. Discuss. That's a tell. What does it mean? It means they're not offering anything yet. They're trying to find out what you know. Genevieve paused. I told him we'd consider a meeting after Tuesday's hearing. He didn't push back, which means they're also trying to figure out their exposure. The exposure question accelerated 2 days later when a journalist named Tobias Wren from the Harmon Valley Courier called Nora's cell phone. She let it go to voicemail. He left a careful, professional message saying he'd been looking into Calloway Meridian Development's history in the city and had come across her name in connection with several property and institutional matters, and that he'd appreciate a conversation if she was willing. She called Ray Tulloch before she called Wren back. "Did you talk to him?" she asked. "I talked to someone who talked to him," Ray said. "He's been working a piece on Calloway Meridian zoning history for about 6 weeks. He connected some of the same dots we did through public records, the board relationships, the permit delays, the pattern across markets. He doesn't have the financial records because those aren't public. But he has enough for a story." "What kind of story?" "The kind that runs in a Sunday edition and gets picked up regionally." A pause. "Nora, this is the public exposure piece. If Wren runs what he has, even without the federal layer, it changes the terrain completely. The board members, the institutional relationships, the contractors at your house. All of it becomes public record that people can access and respond to. Or it tips Calloway off that we're further along than he thinks. He already knows something is wrong. The injunction denial, the civil complaint, Dressler asking to discuss terms. He's been reading the signals. A story in the Courier isn't going to surprise him, but it's going to make it harder for him to apply local pressure when the pressure is visible." She thought about it for a long moment. "What does Farrow think?" Farrow said, and I'm quoting here, that she can't tell you what to do with a journalist, but she also said that public documentation of the pattern historically accelerates federal timelines because it generates political pressure on the enforcement division to move. Nora called Wren back that afternoon and agreed to speak on background, which meant he could use the information but not attribute it to her by name. She gave him 2 hours. She was precise and factual, and she did not editorialize, and she did not tell him about Farrow or the federal inquiry. She told him about the HR review, the board connection to Calloway Meridian events, the noise complaints, the injunction, the contractors at her home, and the documented pattern of similar events in other markets that Ray's research had pulled up. Wren asked good questions. He pushed on the board connection and she gave him Philip Wardell's name, which he received with a stillness that told her he'd already found it independently and was now confirming. "One question off the record," he said at the end. "Ask it. Are there other parties looking at Calloway's activities? Not local." She held that for a moment. "I can't speak to that." I was quiet. "Okay," he said. "Thank you for your time." She hung up and sat in her car, which had become, over the last week, the place she made phone calls she didn't want Cora to overhear. The afternoon light was flat and gray, the kind that came before rain. She thought about Damon and the question Cora had asked that morning that she hadn't fully answered. She thought about cornered men. The Courier story ran on Friday. It was the lead piece in the weekend edition, front page below the fold, with the headline, "Development Firm's Harmon Valley Expansion Raises Questions About Board Influence and Community Pressure." It ran 1,400 words and named Philip Wardell, Calloway Meridian Development, and the stalled East Side Project. It named 3 other markets where similar patterns had occurred. It quoted 2 former business associates of Garrett Calloway's in other cities who described his methods as aggressive and structured to avoid direct accountability. It did not name Nora, but it described a current situation involving a residential community where complaints had been filed and an injunction had been denied, which was specific enough that anyone who knew about Cedar Line Drive would know immediately. She read it at 6 a.m. at her kitchen table. She read it twice. It was accurate. It was carefully sourced. It was the kind of story that created a particular problem for people like Garrett Calloway, not because it proved illegality, but because it created a public frame. Once a frame existed in public, every subsequent action got read through it. She sent Cora to Petra Solis's house for the day, which Cora resisted and then accepted when Nora said it was one day and she needed it. Then she waited. Garrett moved faster than she expected. By 9 a.m., there was a letter from Dressler's firm in her email, formally worded, legally precise, stating that his client denied all characterizations in the Courier story, that the story was materially false in several respects that would be addressed through appropriate channels, and that Nora Voss, as a likely source of information, might expect to be called as a witness in a defamation action against the publication. She forwarded it to Genevieve with the note, "They're threatening the journalist through me." Genevieve's reply came back in 4 minutes. Classic misdirection. "They can't touch the journalist through you if you spoke on background. They know that. This letter is about making you nervous." At 10:30, Philip Wardell resigned from the Harmon Valley General Board. The hospital put out a brief statement describing it as a personal decision, which nobody who had read the morning paper believed, but which gave the institution a clean exit from the story. Nora learned about Wardell's resignation from Marcus, who had a contact on the hospital's governance committee. She was in her kitchen when Marcus called and she stood very still while he told her, and then she sat down because the specific combination of confirmation and consequence hit her in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. Wardell was gone. The mechanism that had generated her HR review had been publicly exposed, and the person at its center had removed himself from the board before he was removed. Her review would quietly die without anyone who had the standing to maintain it. "It's moving," Marcus said. "It's moving," she agreed. "How are you?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Tired," she said. "Clearer than I've been in weeks, but tired." "That's reasonable." He paused. Garrett Calloway was apparently at the Courier's offices this morning with Dressler. Whatever they said, Wren's editor backed the story. "I heard that from Petra, who heard it from someone at the paper." "Good." "Nora." His voice shifted to something more careful. "Damon wasn't at the house this morning. His car was gone before 6. Garrett's still there. I can see the SUV. But the boy—" "I saw," she said. She had noticed the absence of Damon's car at 5:45 when she'd checked the camera app out of habit. She had been sitting with what it meant since then. "I don't know where he went." "You should probably find out." She already agreed. She just didn't know how yet. She found out at 12:40 p.m., not because she tracked him, but because he came back. She heard the car first, the specific sound of his engine, which she had inadvertently memorized over 2 months of living next door to it. She looked out the front window. He parked in the driveway and sat in the car for almost a minute before he got out. He looked different, not in any dramatic way. Same clothes, same posture, same physical presence. But something in his face had changed. The looseness was gone. He looked like someone who had spent the morning somewhere that had required something from him, and he was still carrying the residue of it. He walked to her front door and knocked. She opened it. She did not invite him in. They looked at each other for a moment. "My dad's lawyer is filing a response to the Courier story today," he said. "I told him not to." She waited. "I told him it would make it worse." He looked at the porch boards for a moment, then back up. He didn't listen. A pause that had actual weight in it. He doesn't, usually. She was looking at him carefully. This was not the version of Damon she had learned to read, not the trained body confidence, not the comfortable contempt. He looked like someone who had woken up to a photograph of himself and not recognized it. "What do you want, Damon?" He exhaled. "I went and talked to one of the guys from the other night, the security contractor. I wanted to know exactly what they were sent to do. He stopped. My dad gave the order. I didn't know about it. I need you to know that. Did you know about the HR review? A pause. Not the specifics. I knew he had a contact at the hospital. I thought he was just making sure you didn't have any real complaints pending that could affect the bracket dispute. He heard how that sounded as he was saying it. She could see him hear it. I know it's not a small distinction, she said. Using a hospital board member to manufacture pressure on a nurse's employment is not a gray area. I know that now. His jaw worked. The school thing. The girl who talked to your daughter. My dad arranged that through a business contact. I found out this morning. I didn't know. She looked at him for a long moment. She had gotten reasonably good, over time, at reading the specific texture of someone telling the truth as distinct from someone telling a version of the truth designed to accomplish something. This felt like the former. She didn't know what to do with that yet. The contractor's in my yard, she said. The camera pointed at my house. Your dad ordered that because the injunction failed and he needed a new angle. Yes. While my daughter was supposed to be home. Something moved across his face. Not quite shame. Something more uncomfortable than shame. The recognition that he had been part of a structure that had done something to a 13-year-old that neither of them could cleanly explain as strategy. I'm not here to ask you to stop what you're doing, he said. I know I don't have that standing. He stopped, tried again. I wanted you to know that I didn't know all of it, and that if you need anything from me, in terms of what I saw, what I know, I'm not going to lie for him. She held his gaze for a long time. This was, she knew, a complicated offer. Not simple, not clean, not without its own problems. I was not a good actor in this story. He'd kicked her compost bag. He'd crowded her daughter in a shared yard. He'd spoken to her with calculated contempt. But he was also not his father, and the distinction mattered for practical reasons, even if it didn't resolve anything moral. I'll be in touch, she said. He nodded. He walked back to the driveway. He stood by his car for a moment, looking at the house he'd grown up in some ways too comfortable inside, and then he got in and sat there, and she closed the door. Agent Farrow called at 3 p.m. Authorization came through, she said. Without preamble, the way she'd conducted every conversation they'd had. We're moving to formal inquiry status. That means Calloway Meridian's records are subject to federal subpoena. Financial documents, communications, board correspondence. Nora sat at her kitchen table. When? We served the subpoena Monday morning. I'm telling you now because once it's served, things are going to move quickly, and I don't want you caught off guard. A pause. The story in the Courier helped, politically. It made the authorization easier to get. I talked to the journalist on background. I know, it was the right move. Farrow's voice was even, professional. I also want to tell you something, off the procedural record. What you put together, the documentation, the timeline, the Wardell connection, it filled a gap we'd been trying to fill for 8 months. 2 of the previous market cases are being reopened as part of this inquiry. People in those markets who were hurt, jobs lost, businesses damaged, they're going to get a formal record of what happened to them. That's because of your file. Nora looked out the kitchen window at the side yard. The garden bed was still disturbed, still waiting for her to fix it. She had been putting it off because every time she looked at it, she felt something hot and directed, and she needed to be past that before she worked in dirt. Because she'd learned in a different life that you didn't do careful work while you were still angry. Thank you for telling me, she said. One thing I need from you this weekend, Farrow continued, Damon Calloway. If he's willing to give a voluntary statement about what he knows regarding his father's methods, the board contacts, the pressure campaigns, anything he witnessed directly, it would accelerate the documentary record significantly. Nora was quiet for a moment. He came to my door this morning, she said. Farrow's pause was brief. What did he say? That he didn't know the full extent of it, that he won't lie for his father. Do you believe him? She thought about his face on the porch, the specific quality of someone who had looked in a mirror that morning and not been able to look away from what they saw. Enough, she said. I believe him enough. Can you ask him if he's willing to meet with us? I'll ask him today. She texted Damon from her kitchen table. A federal agent wants to speak with you. Voluntary. Your decision. She hit send before she could think about it more than she already had. because overthinking something like this was how people talked themselves out of the right action. His reply came back in 8 minutes. When? She forwarded the exchange to Pharaoh without comment. Then she drove to Petra's house to pick up Cora and spent the afternoon doing absolutely nothing she could define. A walk, a stop at the hardware store for more tarp to replace the damaged one, half an hour in the car listening to the radio in the parking lot because she needed 20 minutes that didn't require anything from her. She was running on a level of sustained alertness that she recognized from operational periods overseas, the kind that felt fine until it didn't, and she had learned the hard way that the crashes came when you stopped moving, so you stayed moving until there was actually a moment to stop. Cora was quiet on this drive home, which was its own communication. She'd been following the story in her own way. Nora could see it in how Cora checked the window when she came downstairs in the morning, in the way she'd started keeping her room door open. 13 was old enough to understand what was happening and young enough for it to still be frightening, and that combination was the hardest place to be. Tuesday's hearing is the civil trespass motion, Nora said, because filling the silence felt better than leaving it empty. After that, some other things are going to start moving. Federal things? Yes. Cora looked out the passenger window. They were on the main road, 2 minutes from Cedar Line Drive. Is it going to get worse before it gets better? Nora thought about how to answer that honestly. Probably a little worse, then significantly better. How significantly? Enough, Nora said. Enough that we don't have to think about them anymore. Cora absorbed that. And until then? Until then, we keep going. Nora turned onto their street. We go to school, we work. We don't let them make our lives smaller than they were before. She pulled into the driveway. She turned the engine off. Across the fence, Garrett Calloway's house was lit in the early evening dark. Windows glowing, the SUV in the driveway, the whole structure quiet and undisturbed, as if none of the last week had touched it. She knew that wasn't true. She knew that inside that house things had been happening all day that she wasn't privy to. Calls to Dressler, calls to the board contacts, calls to Philip Wardell, who was no longer on the board and therefore no longer useful. She knew that Garrett Calloway was doing what people in his position did when the ground moved under them, pulling levers, making calculations, deciding which sacrifices were acceptable to preserve the core. She did not know yet that he had already made the calculation about which sacrifice he intended to make. She did not know what was in the email sitting in her inbox, unopened, arrived 12 minutes ago while she'd been driving, from an address she didn't recognize, with the subject line reading only, "You should know what they found." She got out of the car. She walked around the hood to the passenger side and waited for Cora. They walked up the porch steps together in the cold. She didn't check her phone until Cora was inside and upstairs, and the house was as settled as it could be. She opened the email at the kitchen table. It was 3 sentences long. The first sentence told her who had sent it. The second sentence told her what had been found during a preliminary review of Calloway Meridian's internal communications, not the federal subpoena, which hadn't been served yet, but something accessed through a different mechanism she didn't fully understand and didn't ask about. The third sentence was the one that made her sit very still for a very long time, because the third sentence told her that her name had appeared in a Calloway Meridian internal memo dated 3 weeks ago, before the injunction, before the contractors, before any of it, in which Garrett Calloway had described her to 2 associates not as a troublesome neighbor, not as a nurse with a complaint, but using words that revealed he had done research on her. Real research. The kind that turned up things she had spent 6 years making sure wouldn't turn up. The memo used her rank, her unit designation. A mission designation that was classified at a level that should have made it inaccessible to a private developer. Garrett Calloway had known exactly who she was for weeks, and he had chosen to come after her anyway. She read the email 4 times. Not because she didn't understand it. She understood it immediately, the way you understood something that confirmed a fear you'd been carrying below the surface without naming it. She read it 4 times because she needed to be certain she wasn't misreading it, wasn't projecting, wasn't letting exhaustion turn a coincidence into a pattern. She wasn't. The memo was real. The language was specific. Her unit designation was not something a commercial developer could find through public records or a basic background check. It didn't exist in public records. It existed in classified files, and accessing classified files required either security clearance or someone who had it. Garrett Calloway had a contact with clearance. or he had paid for access to someone who did, which was its own category of federal crime that had nothing to do with bribery or institutional influence, and everything to do with national security statutes that carried sentences measured in decades. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She was not afraid. She examined that carefully, checked it the way she checked her own vitals in high-stress moments, looking for what was actually there rather than what should be, and confirmed it. Not fear. Something older and more specific. The feeling of having been studied by someone who believed that knowing what you were capable of meant they had already defeated you. Garrett Calloway had found out who she was, had known for weeks, had looked at her record, whatever portion of it he'd been able to access, and decided to come after her anyway. That told her something important about how he thought. He believed information was leverage. He believed that knowing someone's history gave you power over them, that a woman who had worked in classified operations would be more afraid of exposure than of him, would back down rather than risk her carefully constructed civilian life being pulled into the light. He had misread every part of that calculation. She picked up her phone and called Ray Tulloch. He answered on the first ring. "You got the email." "You sent it." "Someone I trust sent it to me. I forwarded it." A pause. "Nora, the way that memo was accessed—" "Don't tell me," she said. "I don't want to know the mechanism." "Okay. What I want to know is whether the memo itself is documentable through legal means. Can Faro get it through the subpoena? If it exists in their internal communications, and it does, I've seen the original, then yes, the subpoena covers all internal documents related to operations in the Harmon Valley market. Then she gets it legally on Monday." Nora paused. "And the clearance question, the access to my classified record, that's a separate matter." "Yes, that goes to a different agency entirely." Ray's voice was careful. "Nora, if this goes where I think it's going, you're not looking at a federal commerce inquiry anymore. You're looking at something that has intelligence community equities." "I know. That's a different category of serious." "I know that too." She looked out the kitchen window at the dark yard. "Forward everything to Faro tonight, whatever you have. Don't sit on it." "Already done," he said, 20 minutes ago. She hung up and stayed at the table until she heard Cora moving around upstairs. The creak of the floor, the sound of water running. Ordinary sounds. She focused on them deliberately, using them as an anchor, because there was a specific kind of vertigo that came when a situation expanded suddenly, and you needed something fixed to orient around. Cora was upstairs. The house was locked. The camera app was running. Everything else was in motion, and she had done what she could do tonight. She went upstairs and knocked on Cora's door. "Come in," Cora said. She was at her desk with her homework open, but she wasn't doing it. She was sitting sideways in the chair with her knees up, looking at nothing in particular. Nora leaned against the doorframe. "Something changed tonight," Nora said. "I'm not going to explain all of it right now because it's complicated and late, and you have school tomorrow, but I need you to know that we're closer to the end of this than the beginning." Cora looked at her. "Are we safe?" It was the most direct question Cora had ever asked her, and it deserved a direct answer. "Yes," Nora said. "We're safe." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Cora turned back to her desk. She picked up her pencil. "Okay," she said, which was the most 13-year-old way possible of saying she was trusting her mother's judgment, and she was terrified, and she was going to finish her homework anyway. Nora loved her so much it was almost structural, built into her bones, load-bearing, the thing that had reoriented her entire life and continued to reorient it whenever she lost track of what she was doing and why. She went to bed. She slept 5 hours. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of November day where the sky was a hard, bright blue, and everything looked sharper than it was. Nora was at the hospital by 6 for her shift. She worked 8 hours without incident, which required a level of compartmentalization she had practiced for years. The ability to be completely present in one context, while an entirely different situation ran in a separate partition of her mind, neither bleeding into the other. She started 2 IVs, managed a post-surgical patient's pain protocol through a complication, talked down a family in the waiting room who had been there for 7 hours and were fraying at the edges. She did the work. She did it well. Whatever was happening on Cedar Line Drive and in federal offices in Northern Virginia, the people in her ward needed a nurse who was present, and she was. At 2:15, Genevieve Sato texted, Subpoena served at Calloway Meridian's regional office. 9:04 a.m. Their counsel filed an objection within the hour. Objection denied by noon. They are now in full compliance mode. She read it between patients and felt the specific satisfaction of something structural giving way. At 3:40, Ray Toloch called. Farrow has the memo. The clearance access question has been referred to a separate investigative body. She can't tell me which one, but she confirmed the referral exists. A pause. Garrett Calloway's attorney contacted the Federal Inquiry Office this afternoon and requested a meeting to discuss cooperation. Nora stopped walking in the middle of the hospital corridor. A passing nurse glanced at her. He's offering to cooperate, she said. His attorney used the word discuss, which is what Dressler said to Genevieve 3 weeks ago, and we know what that actually meant. Ray's voice was measured. But the timing is different now. The subpoena is served. The clearance referral is active. This isn't him testing the temperature. This is him reading the room and deciding that voluntary cooperation is better than what happens when they find everything without his help. Will Farrow take the meeting? She'll take it, and she'll listen, and she won't give him anything he can use to limit his exposure. That's her job. A pause. Nora. He's moving toward something. The question is whether he gets in front of it or gets run over by it. Either way, the case moves. Either way, the case moves, he agreed. She finished her shift and drove home on autopilot, her mind running through what cooperation meant, and what it didn't mean, and what the next 2 weeks were likely to look like. Cooperation didn't mean charges disappeared. It meant the timeline compressed and the documentation became more complete, and the people further down the chain, Philip Wardell, the board contact in other markets, whoever had pulled her classified record, became easier to prosecute because the man at the center was filling in the gaps. Garrett Calloway was offering to help build the case against the people around him in exchange for whatever terms his attorney could negotiate. That was not a man who thought he was going to walk away clean. That was a man who had done the math and decided that some outcome was better than the worst one. She pulled onto Cedar Line Drive and noticed immediately that the Calloway SUV was not in the driveway. Tuesday's hearing took 40 minutes. Judge Vane reviewed the civil trespass complaint, the camera footage, the incident report, and the security contractor's business registration, which listed Calloway Meridian Development as an active client. She reviewed the timeline showing the hearing came 72 hours after the injunction denial. She looked at Dressler over her reading glasses with an expression that was entirely professional and contained behind its professionalism, something that was not quite displeasure but was in its vicinity. The protective relief was granted. The Calloway family, their representatives, their contractors, and any parties acting on their behalf were formally prohibited from entering, accessing, or surveilling any portion of Nora Voss's private property or the shared community space on Cedar Line Drive without prior written notice and consent, pending the resolution of the civil matter. Violation of the order was contempt of court. Dressler filed no objection. He gathered his papers and left without making eye contact with anyone. Nora sat in the hallway outside the courtroom afterward while Marcus went to get the car and Genevieve handled the paperwork. The courthouse hallway was its own kind of quiet. Marble floors, high ceilings, the sound of footsteps and distant doors, and the institutional hum of a building that processed human conflict all day and managed to remain impersonal about it. She was sitting with her hands in her lap when she heard footsteps stop near her. She looked up. Garrett Calloway was standing 10 feet away. He was alone. No Dressler, no assistant, no buffer. He was wearing a coat she hadn't seen before, charcoal gray, and he looked like a man who had aged several years in the last week. Not physically exactly. Something in the way he was carrying himself. Some loss of the specific mass that confident men accumulated around themselves without noticing it. They looked at each other. She did not stand up. "I know you were in the building," she said. "Dressler's firm is on the 4th floor." "I was here for a separate matter." He said it without conviction. She waited. He looked at the marble floor for a moment, then back at her. "I want you to know that what happened at your house, the contractors, the night, I made a mistake in judgment. I gave an instruction that I shouldn't have given. You gave it because the injunction failed and you needed a new mechanism." "Yes." He didn't try to reframe it. That surprised her slightly. "I want you to know that Damon, what happened at your daughter's school? He didn't know. I've been He stopped. Tried again. He's not going to be part of what comes next. Whatever comes next. She studied him. This was not the Garrett Calloway who had come to her door with a highlighted piece of paper and the practiced ease of a man who expected to win. This was someone in the early stages of understanding that he wasn't going to, and finding the experience genuinely foreign. What comes next, she said, is the process. It's going to run the way it runs. I know that. Then I don't know what you want from this conversation. He was quiet for a moment. I suppose I wanted to see if you were the kind of person who would listen. I'll always listen, she said. Listening isn't the same as forgiving. He nodded once. He walked away. She watched him go, and she felt, not satisfaction, not triumph, those were the wrong shapes. Something more like finality. The recognition that a thing had run its course and arrived somewhere real. Marcus came around this corner with his keys. He looked at Garrett Calloway's retreating back, and then at Nora. What was that? He asked. A man learning what it costs, she said. She stood up. Let's go home. What? The Courier ran a follow-up story on Thursday. This one was shorter, 800 words, tight and specific. It reported that a federal subpoena had been served on Calloway Meridian Development, that a former hospital board member had resigned citing personal reasons, and that 2 former market area cases involving the firm were under active federal review. It quoted a former associate in one of the other cities, a woman who had lost her business license during a Calloway Meridian expansion in her town, who said she was relieved the pattern was finally being examined. It did not name Nora. It did not need to. Within 24 hours of the story running, the Harmon Valley General Administration sent a formal letter to Nora's home address confirming that the administrative review of her staffing assignment had been closed as unfounded and that her overnight schedule remained unchanged. The letter was signed by the chief nursing officer and included a note, not official language, just a line at the bottom, that said the CNO was sorry for any disruption the process had caused. Nora read the note twice. She thought about how much that line had probably cost the CNO to write, given how it had started, and she appreciated it anyway. She pinned the letter to the corkboard above her desk next to Cora's last report card and a postcard from Ray Tulloch that had arrived years ago from a place she couldn't name, and that she'd kept without knowing exactly why. That evening, Petra Solis brought over a casserole without calling first, which was its own kind of statement. She stood on the porch and handed it over and said, I'm proud of you, which Nora hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to receive. I just did what anyone would do, Nora said. Petra shook her head. No, anyone would have backed down after the HR letter. You didn't. She paused. You should know that 3 people on this block who didn't say anything during the association meeting have been talking about it since the Courier story. They feel bad they didn't speak up earlier. Tell them not to, Nora said. It's easier to stay quiet. There's no shame in it. You didn't stay quiet. I had different reasons. Petra gave her a look that said she wasn't fully buying that answer but wasn't going to push it tonight, and went home. Nora ate the casserole with Cora at the kitchen table, and it was the best meal she'd had in a month. Not because of the food, but because of what it meant to sit across from her daughter and feel, for the first time in weeks, that the ground under the table was solid. Damon Calloway met with Agent Farrow on a Friday afternoon at a neutral location, a federal building downtown, nothing dramatic. Nora didn't know the content of what he said. She wasn't entitled to it and didn't ask. What she knew was that the meeting lasted 3 hours, which Ray said was significant, and that Damon had brought his own attorney, which said he'd taken it seriously. He came to her door 2 days later. It was a Sunday afternoon, gray and cold, and he looked like he hadn't slept especially well in a while. She opened the door and waited. I want to say something, he said. Okay. I've spent a lot of years thinking that the way my father operated was just how things worked. That if you had resources, you used them, and if people couldn't handle that, that was their problem. He looked at the porch rail, then back at her. What he did to you, to your daughter. That's not how things work. That's just how he made them work for him. And I let myself not look at the difference. She leaned against the doorframe. You were 23, she said. That's not an excuse. No, but it's a context. She looked at him directly. You came to my door before the federal meeting. You told me you wouldn't lie for him. That matters. It doesn't undo it. No, she agreed. It doesn't undo it, but it counts. She paused. What are you going to do now? He let out a breath. I'm leaving. I've got a place I can stay while whatever happens to the house happens. He glanced at the Calloway property. My coach in the city has been asking me to come back to serious training for a year. I've been using this neighborhood as an excuse not to. He looked almost embarrassed saying it. I think I've been afraid that if I actually competed at the level I could compete at and lost, I wouldn't have anything to blame it on. It was the most honest thing she'd heard him say. More than the apology, more than the statement about his father. It had the specific texture of someone who had just articulated something they'd known for a long time and never said out loud. Go train, she said. Lose some fights. You'll be better for it. He almost smiled. That's not what people usually say. Most people haven't watched you compete. He did smile then. Briefly, a little crooked. Nothing like the smile he'd used in the driveway on his first day. Then he nodded. He walked to his car. He drove away, and she had the sense that she was watching something conclude. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but honestly, which was closer to real resolution than anything perfect could be. The federal case moved the way. Federal cases moved, not quickly, but steadily, with the institutional weight of something that had been wound up properly and didn't need external pressure to keep going. Garrett Calloway's cooperation agreement was finalized in late December. It was never publicly announced, but the outline of it became visible through what followed. Philip Wardell was charged with federal bribery and misuse of a fiduciary position, with Calloway's testimony as a central element. A business associate in one of the previous market cities faced similar charges related to a different board relationship. The Calloway Meridian East Side Development Project was suspended pending investigation, with no projected restart date. Garrett Calloway himself was charged in February. Not with everything, cooperation agreements were, by their nature, transactional, and prosecutors traded some exposure for other exposure, but with 2 counts of commercial bribery and 1 count related to the unauthorized access of a protected personnel file. The clearance question had indeed gone to a different agency, and that agency had done its work quietly and thoroughly the way it did everything. His attorney negotiated. There were hearings. The process was not dramatic because federal processes rarely were. They were procedural and exhausting, and they ground forward regardless of how much money you had, once they were in motion. The commercial bribery charges carried significant civil penalties in addition to potential criminal outcomes. The development firm's assets in Harmon Valley were frozen pending resolution. Nora followed enough of it to know what was happening, and then made a deliberate choice to stop following every detail, because paying attention to the process was its own kind of leash, and she had other things to do. She planted the garden bed in April. She had been planning it since October, and had lost 2 months of planting window to the chaos. But April was still workable for what she had in mind. Herbs along the south edge, some tomatoes, the lavender that Cora had been asking about for 2 years, and that Nora had been putting off because it felt frivolous. She decided that frivolous was underrated and put in 6 lavender plants along the border closest to the fence. Cora came out and helped for about 40 minutes before her phone became more interesting. This was the correct amount of time for a 13-year-old to help with a garden, and Nora had no complaints about it. Marcus and Delphine Abernathy came over the following Saturday for the first time since everything had started, and they sat on the back porch while the weather was still cold enough to need jackets and drank coffee and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. Delphine had opinions about which variety of tomato did best in this climate and expressed them with the confidence of someone who had grown tomatoes in this neighborhood for 30 years. Nora listened and took notes on her phone and felt the specific relief of an afternoon that was just an afternoon. The Calloway house sold in March. Quickly, below asking. The circumstances of the family's departure had not gone unnoticed by the market, whatever the agents tried to frame it as. A couple in their 30s bought it, with a dog named after a kind of cheese that Cora found hilarious, and that turned out to be extremely friendly and completely uninterested in property lines. The new neighbors asked, at their first meeting, whether there was any kind of neighborhood gathering coming up. Nora said there was an association meeting in May and that people usually brought food. They said that sounded great. It was such a small and ordinary conversation that she stood in her front yard for a moment after they went inside and felt the full weight of what ordinary had cost to get back to. In May, Harmon Valley General asked her to participate in a community nursing forum, a panel discussion on workforce advocacy and institutional accountability in healthcare settings. The request came from a new board member, appointed after Wardell's departure, who had read about the Courier story and connected it to the HR review and wanted to make something productive out of the institutional failure. She said yes, with conditions. She would speak about the experience structurally, not personally. She would not name Wardell Shab. He was in the legal process, and that wasn't her job. She would talk about what it looked like when institutional channels were used against the people they were meant to protect, and what workers could document, and why documentation mattered. She spent 3 nights preparing notes, and then mostly didn't use them because the conversation in the room was real, and she responded to what was actually there rather than what she'd prepared for, which had always been her best mode. Afterward, a young nurse named Simone stopped her in the hallway. 26, fresh out of her first year in the ED, with the particular combination of competence and exhaustion that Nora recognized from her own early years. "Can I ask you something?" Simone said. "Sure." "Were you scared? During all of it?" Nora thought about how to answer that honestly. "Not in the way you might think," she said. "I was angry. I was tired. I was worried about my daughter." She paused. "Fear is a specific thing. It's about not knowing what you're capable of. I've had enough hard experiences to know what I can carry." She looked at Simone directly. "You will too. You just have to stay in it long enough to find out." Simone nodded slowly, processing that. "They never teach you that part." "No," Nora said, "they don't. That's why people like us have to." She drove home in the May evening with the windows down, which she never did because she was always either too hot or too cold or in too much of a hurry. Tonight she had the time and the air was right, the specific temperature of late spring that didn't ask anything of you, and she drove slower than necessary through streets she knew without thinking about them. She had built this life twice, the first time quickly, out of necessity, running from something she couldn't name yet. The second time deliberately, on Cedar Line Drive, with a daughter and a garden bed and a hospital full of people who needed what she could give. The Calloways had tried to use what she'd been against what she was. What they hadn't understood, what people like Garrett Calloway were structurally incapable of understanding, was that those two things weren't in conflict. The woman who had operated in classified spaces, and the woman who ran IVs at 2 in the morning, and the woman who stood in the side yard and refused to be moved, were all the same person. You didn't get to reach into one version of someone's life and use it to hollow out another. Not if they knew who they were. She had always known who she was. That was, in the end, the only thing that had ever protected her. Cora turned 14 in June. She asked for a small party, 4 friends, the back porch, the kind of afternoon that didn't require much organizing but felt significant anyway. Nora made the cake herself, which turned out lopsided in a way that Cora photographed and posted somewhere online, with a caption that Nora saw briefly, and that was affectionate in the specific way teenagers were affectionate when they thought nobody important was watching. Late in the afternoon, when the friends had dispersed, and Cora was sitting on the porch steps in the golden end-of-day light with her shoes off, Nora brought out 2 glasses of lemonade and sat next to her. "Good birthday?" Nora asked. "Yeah." Cora leaned her head sideways against her mother's shoulder for a moment, briefly, the way she did things now, with the self-consciousness of someone who was aging out of easy affection but hadn't fully let it go yet. "Mom." "Yeah." "That girl at school, the one who said stuff about your credentials." Cora was quiet for a moment. "She apologized. Last week. She said her dad told her to say something to me." A pause. "I didn't know what to do with it." "What did you say?" "I said okay." Cora looked at the lavender along the garden edge, which had taken and was doing well. "Is that the right thing?" "There isn't one right thing," Nora said. "But okay is honest. It doesn't say more than you meant." "I'm still kind of angry about it." "That's allowed." Nora looked at the garden too. "Anger doesn't have an expiration date. You just decide what to do with it. You can let it burn through or you can put it somewhere useful. Both are valid. Just don't let it pick your choices for you." Cora was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you did? Put it somewhere useful?" Nora thought about Ray Tulloch and Marcus Abernathy and Sylvia Marsh's careful non-answers and Genevieve Sato's 20-minute argument that dismantled a legal filing in front of a judge who was paying attention. She thought about Simone in the hospital hallway and the young nurse's face when she'd said what she said about knowing what you can carry. "Yeah," she said, "that's what I did." Cora straightened up. She picked up her lemonade. She looked at the yard. The lavender and the tomatoes and the place where the garden bed had been scraped and then replanted and was now just a garden bed again, doing what it was supposed to do. I want to do what you do, Cora said. The nursing, someday. Nora looked at her. Not the military part, Cora added quickly. Just the part where you actually fix things, where what you do means someone gets to go home. It landed somewhere deep in Nora's chest and stayed there. You'd be good at it, she said. You're already better at reading people than most adults I know. I learned from someone, Cora said, simply, not as a compliment, just as a fact. The evening light went long and gold across the yard. Somewhere in the new neighbor's house, the dog was barking at something that turned out to be nothing, the way dogs did. Petrosolis's front light came on across the street. The street settled into itself the way streets did at the end of a good day, ordinary and unremarkable and entirely sufficient. Nora sat on the porch steps with her daughter and drank her lemonade and let the quiet be quiet. She had not fixed everything. The federal process would run for another year at least, with hearings and filings and the slow machinery of accountability doing its necessary, imperfect work. Damon Calloway was competing again, somewhere in the city, winning some and losing some, which was exactly what she'd told him to do. The Abernathy's garden had a new section this year because Delphine had been inspired by Nora's beds to expand her own, which was a small and genuine thing. The people who had been hurt in other cities, the woman who'd lost her business license, the man whose job hadn't survived a Calloway pressure campaign 3 years ago, were in the process of having their experiences formally acknowledged by a federal record. That was not the same as being made whole, but it was the difference between a wound that closed and a wound that was pretended not to exist, and the difference mattered. None of it was smooth, none of it was complete. Life didn't work that way, and she had stopped expecting it to somewhere around the age of 26, in a place she couldn't name, holding someone's hand while they decided whether to keep fighting. She had learned then, and relearned it on Cedar Line Drive, that the question was never whether things were going to be hard. The question was whether you were going to be someone who stood in the hard thing or someone who let the hard thing choose for you. She had always stood. That was not because she was exceptional. It was not because of her training or her background or the particular skills she'd spent years building and then years trying not to need. It was because she had decided, early and repeatedly, that the version of herself who backed down out of fear of cost was not someone she was willing to become. Most people never got to find out what they were made of. They went their whole lives making the quiet compromise, the strategic retreat, the careful calculation about how much trouble was worth having, and they mistook that for wisdom. Some of it was wisdom, but some of it was just fear wearing a reasonable face. The difference, in Nora's experience, was whether you were choosing or being chosen for, whether you were deciding what your life meant or letting someone else's agenda decide it for you. She had been underestimated on Cedar Line Drive. She had been assessed as a quiet woman in a rental who would calculate the cost of fighting and find it too high. She had been approached with the specific confidence of people who had spent years learning that most people, when squeezed correctly, would eventually yield. They had not been wrong about most people. They had just been wrong about her. And the lesson of that, the thing worth carrying forward, the thing she would say to Simone and to Cora and to anyone else who ever found themselves standing across from someone who had decided, without asking, that they already knew the outcome, was this. The person who underestimates you has already made their most important mistake. They have handed you the advantage of being unexpected. They have shown you exactly what they think of you, which tells you exactly how they think, which tells you exactly where they are vulnerable. Stay quiet. Do the work. Document everything. Build the case. And when the moment comes, not the moment you lose your temper, not the moment you perform strength for an audience, but the real moment, the one that matters, be exactly what you've always been. That's enough. That has always been enough. The lavender along the fence smelled faintly in the evening air. The lemonade was too sweet because Cora had made it and Cora always put in too much sugar. The neighbor's dog had stopped barking. Nora Voss sat on her porch in the life she had built and rebuilt and refused to have taken from her, and she was not a hero in the way stories usually meant it. Not flawless, not fearless, not operating above the mess of being human. She was tired sometimes. She got things wrong. She had spent years running from a past that wasn't actually chasing her and lost time she couldn't get back. But she was here. She was whole. She was exactly who she had decided to be. And that, in the end, was the only fight that had ever actually mattered.